is ready.
I'll sing, I'll dance, I'll ham it up, but I am not doing any coupling for the roundup. Ooh.
My perfect guy would have dark hair, think Zac Efron, that smouldering look, nice face tan.
That's my six-pack. No, it's not. Get off.
Our boys have certainly got six-packs, but wait, there could be trouble on Love Island. How will our contestants cope with real chaos? Union leader Manuel Cortez thinks Jeremy Corbyn has the answer.
Andrew, the only way the passengers and taxpayers will win is if we renationalise our railways.
And what's the role of scandal on our Love Island? Are they asking comedian Andy Zaltzman?
The real scandal is that this show has a bigger per-episode budget than Game of Thrones.
This studio is ready. Pour the Blue Nun. Cue those sexy guests. It's This Week. Evening all, welcome to This Week, live from the heart of the Brexit Bermuda Triangle, into which British politics has disappeared without trace. You think I exaggerate? Then consider this. Not only don't we yet know the government's negotiating position for trade and custom arrangements with the EU post-Brexit, we don't even know when the government plans to publish its white paper containing said negotiating position. But it is only 2 years since the Brexit referendum and 14 months since the Maybot triggered the negotiating process. So perhaps we expect too much too quickly. Her Majesty's loyal opposition has provided more clarity. We know Labour's positions on the customs union and the single market. And knowing all that, we could also be pretty sure that they wouldn't stand 24-hour scrutiny in Brussels. As for the smaller parties, nobody's certain that Vince the Cable is still leader of the Liberal Democrats. So long has he been missing in inaction. And Caroline Lucas no longer wants to be leader of the Greens, even on a job share. Always ready to fill a vacuum, Boris Johnson has inevitably waded in, with reports tonight that he told a bunch of Tory activists that Donald Trump should take over the Brexit talks. That, he opined, was a very, very good thought. No doubt David Davis has already thanked the Foreign Secretary for his vote of confidence. In the absence of the Donald, the government has proposed giving itself, I kid you not, till December 2021 to finalise our new arrangements with the EU. Asked if even that was enough time, one Whitehall wit said tonight, of course, it's taken the government only 7 years to sign up 150,000 folk to universal credit. Speaking of those who've long resided in their own Bermuda Triangle of obscurity, after brief brushes with fame, or more accurately, notoriety, I'm joined on the sofa tonight by two commentators who are only allowed out onto the public airwaves after most sane folks have gone to bed, and even then only with their carers in close proximity. I speak, of course, of Michael #Choo-Choo Patillo and Alan #Sadman on the left, Johnson. Michael, your moment.
Well, the moment for me was this morning when I heard that David Davis had resigned from the cabinet.
Oh, you heard he'd resigned?
I'd heard it. It turned out to be a false rumour.
Oh.
But in the moment in which I believed it to be true, I suddenly realised all the consequences. Because, of course, the levers in the Conservative Party would have rounded on Mrs May. There would have been, I think, a leadership contest in the Conservative Party. The government, I think, would have fallen apart. There would have been no possibility whatsoever of continuing even our meagre negotiating position as we have it now, because we would have been essentially without government. We might well have been thrown into a general election and almost anything might have happened. Now, this sort of counterfactual analysis perhaps helps to explain why he hasn't resigned from the cabinet, why Mrs May has given him a mini victory on establishing... A mini victory-ish, exactly. Because had he left at the moment, I mean, the whole game would have been over.
So you were misled with fake news this morning. Will you now stop listening to Russia Today?
It was a person who stopped me in the street.
Ah, but was he Russian?
David Davis. Yeah, he had a Glasgow accent.
It was David Davis. Ah, because you were in Glasgow. Very well. Alan?
Mine was Sunday night, watching the telly. First of all, watching the last part of A Very English Scandal.
Just wonderful.
And then watching the documentary, the Tom Mangold documentary.
Again, just wonderful.
So you watched the drama, which was amazing, but you thought, oh, that's a bit far-fetched. Then you watched the documentary and you found it was absolutely accurate. Now, there was an entertaining side to that. Fabulous drama, great performance by Hugh Grant. And it was a bit of kind of carry on up the Palace of Westminster bit, the way it was written by Russell T. Hunter. But then when you thought about it, what a dark and sinister thing.
Yes.
The Old Boy Network had got the police, the judiciary, senior Home Office ministers, and I have to say the BBC. Mangold was told
He
that
made the documentary 40 years ago.
it had to be destroyed.
Yes,
He kept
and
his own
he
copy.
kept his own.
All conspiring to help a senior politician to escape a charge of attempted murder. I mean, it is chilling, quite
It is chilling. Actually, if somebody wrote it as fiction, we'd probably say, it's too far-fetched.
Too far-fetched, yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
The Transport Secretary chugged into the Commons this week on the world-famous failing Grayling Express. Naturally, it was late and overcrowded. He was there to explain the extraordinary timetable chaos affecting Northern Rail and Thameslink, which wiped out hundreds of services at a stroke. Compensation has been promised and deputy heads are threatened with the sack. A bit like the BBC. Of course, it's just the latest debacle in our privatised railways as commuters cope with delays, high fares, no seats and strikes. It's caused some to wonder whether those nationalised British rail years were complete with surly staff and curly sandwiches. Were they really so bad after all? Mambo Cortez is from the transport union TSSA. He thinks the railway should be taken back under state control. This is his take of the week.
The privatisation of our precious railways has been an unmitigated disaster. We were promised that it would deliver a model rail service with a lower level of public subsidy and lower fares. The privatisation of our precious railways has been an unmitigated disaster. We were promised that it would deliver a model rail service with a lower level of public subsidy and lower fares. But those of you who are long-suffering commuters know that this dream has been derailed by private sector incompetence. We now have the highest walk-on fares and season ticket prices in Europe. In real terms, public subsidy has more than doubled. We are paying for a Rolls-Royce service whilst being taken for a ride in a Reliant Robin. After this week's chaos, Tory privatisation lies are clear for all to see. Don't take it from me. Transport Secretary Chris Grayling would rather walk barefoot on broken glass than vindicate Jeremy Corbyn's rail policy, which is to create publicly owned London and North Eastern Railway. Can't be held back by a system that doesn't work. We urgently need a new structure for our railways. A reintegrated, publicly owned rail network which brings back together our trains and our track. No other model will do.
And thanks to the fine Motor Rail Club in King's Cross. It's the oldest in the world. I think Michael already knew that. Manuel Cortez joins us now. Welcome to the programme. Michael, has privatisation broadly been a success or a failure?
Broadly a success, because before privatisation about 700 million passenger journeys were made every year, and today 1.7 billion passenger journeys. When I was the Minister of State for Railways, which I was between 88 and 90, I was constantly going to fatal crashes when the railways were publicly owned. I went to the Clapham crash, the Milngavie crash, the Purley crash. I had to fire the chairman and the chief executive of London Underground, which was then a publicly owned railway, because of the fire at King's Cross, which was much worse than the Grenfell Tower fire, because there had been repeated fires in escalators which had been ignored. British Rail was the company that wanted to close the Carlisle to Settle railway line. People had this extraordinarily rosy view of what it was like, but it was actually not at all good. And the bit of the railway which is doing really badly today is the bit that is in public hands, that is, say, Network Rail. It has made the most appalling catastrophe of trying to electrify the West Coast Main Line. It is a disaster and a disgrace, and it is the same publicly owned company, Network Rail, which is behind the disaster which is happening now with Northern Rail, because it was the failure to do the infrastructure projects in time, which meant that the wrong trains are having to be used by Northern Rail, which means the drivers have not been trained to do the job. So if you want the proof of how bad public ownership is, you needn't look further than Network Rail.
Manuel, respond to that.
Well, I think he's been really selective, isn't it? Because he hasn't talked about Ladbroke Grove, Porter's Bar,
Hatfield.
That all happened when the railways were privatised.
Yeah, but the railways, British Rail, or British Railways, if I can call it that today, are the safest in Europe.
Well, what we're talking here today is about the chaos that has elapsed over the last week.
No, we're talking here about people's lives, and no one has been killed on the railways for 10 years now.
Yes, since the Labour government renationalised Network Rail. That's the reality of it. Network Rail was brought into public ownership, and since then,
but the trains are privately operated, so it's a joint state-private and British. But look, the railways in France are publicly owned. The railways in Germany are publicly owned. Yeah. British railways are now the safe. The only one that's close to it is Sweden. They're the safest in Europe. What could be wrong with that?
Well, I tell you what's wrong with that. The first thing is that they are only the safest in Europe because the Labour government brought failing rail track into public ownership and created Network Rail. Because before that, Railtrack was more interested in building shopping malls than in looking after their assets.
And that's true. They put a lot of investment into non-rail things.
And where's the investment coming that is making the railway safe?
Okay.
You and me are paying for it. It's taxpayers' money. It's taxpayers' money.
A shopping mall doesn't make the railway safe, clearly.
Oh, but that's what they were interested in building.
Where are you on this?
I support privatisation.
Sorry,
nationalisation. and Michael,
we had a scoop of
Michael was being selective. I mean, a number of journeys, there's a whole host of reasons why a number of journeys
cyclical.
have gone up.
They're usually cyclical.
And don't forget Hatfield. When Hatfield happened in 2000, it's my line, the East Coast. When Hatfield happened, that was one of several terrible accidents that made Stephen Byers bring Network Rail back into public ownership and then start putting the investment that it needed into British Rail. I have one caveat about this now, and I've come to this conclusion because there are issues about the finance here, about how you do it.
Well, I'll come on to
that. In terms of what he was part of the cabinet in 1993, what their white paper said would happen and what the government said would happen, that's not happened at all. Subsidies have gone up, fares have gone up, and you've got the chaos that you get now from not having an integrated system.
But Michael's point on the chaos is a lot of that is caused by the state-owned part of the railways.
No one's saying Network Rail should be privatised, by the way.
Absolutely. No, it's state-owned.
But part of Network Rail's success in getting the safety record, and you can't have it both ways, it is Network Rail that's really responsible for the safety, is because of the investment that's gone in. Now, they're carrying £60 billion worth of debt, but that investment, that's years of underinvestment in our railways, where France and Germany and other countries, Scandinavia, were investing.
Michael, I mean, when you look at some of the recent history, I mean, you take the East Coast line, it's like the Hokey Cokey line. I mean, it was owned by the state, it was then private. It was put back into the state, it was then private. It's now gone back into the state. I mean, even if you're in favour of privatisation, you could hardly say that government has made much of a success of this. It doesn't really know how to run the franchises properly.
Yes, I mean, I regret that these franchises have gone backwards and forwards, but I think franchises are nonetheless a very important thing. because it does mean that people can be kicked out of their franchises, and people are being kicked out of their franchises, and new management comes in, and that does at least keep management on its toes.
But kicking the franchise people out of the East Coast line, which is essentially what they're walking away from it, but that's costing us $2 billion.
Yes.
It's not costing them. We're picking up the tab.
Well, it's going to cost us anyway. I mean, the real...
Why?
Well, because railways never run at a profit by themselves. I mean,
but the level of public subsidy has doubled. It has doubled.
No, not since the 1860s.
East Coast
Have railways in general.
These coasts, when it was in public hands, returned £1 billion to the Treasury.
25 million a year.
It's going to require public subsidy, and the only question is, what is the best way of achieving the public subsidy? And I think it is.
Hang on, Michael.
I think it is through privatisation.
You must have sat around the cabinet table when the major government was promising that subsidy will decrease. It's actually doubled. That fares will go down. We now have the highest fares in Europe, and they're rising above inflation.
That's because people can't see the future. When
Can't see the future.
When your beloved Mr. Beveridge proposed the National Health Service, he said the cost of he said the cost of health would go down because people would get healthier and healthier and healthier. People can't see the future.
Bevan, not Beveridge.
Was British Rail that good?
No, Beveridge said that.
I think British Rail, considering that it was not properly funded,
That's because it was owned by the state.
Well, actually, the state made the decision not to fund it,
Yeah.
but the state, having privatised the railway, then made the decision to fund it, because actually we've had record levels of investment. I would contend that had British Rail had the investment that the private sector has had, they will be running the trains for free.
But the point is, if it is owned by the state, which means the state will then have to provide the capital investment, not just the subsidies for the running costs.
The state has
but all the capital investment.
The state has provided the capital investment.
No, the private companies in this country put in almost $1 billion to the rolling stock. If it's state-owned, the state, rightly or wrongly, will have to provide it. Let me finish the question.
Let me pick you on that.
It's $1 billion.
I tell you, they put in $1 billion.
Yeah.
What they then do is they extract a higher level of return that the state would have had to pay had we bought the trains directly.
Let me tell you how.
That's the reality.
I would like just to finish. No, hold on. Let me finish. Let me finish the question. If it's owned by the state, which may be the right thing to do, that's not my argument, but it will have to join a queue for capital investment among everything else that the state runs and owns, from the health service to schools to other utilities.
Andrew,
it's not guaranteed investment.
No.
This was actually, you asked me about sitting around the cabinet table. This was actually one of the big drivers, not only of privatisation of the railways, but privatisation of everything else. I'll give you the best example. British Airways, which was nationalised, came to us and said, we need to buy 747-400s because everybody else has got them. And we said, sorry, you can't, because the public sector borrowing requirement is this big, and we've got to pay this much on schools and this much on social security. And we realised that you couldn't go on owning these assets and telling people that they couldn't borrow to invest for what was needed, because the only way you could do that was if they were privatised and they went to the market.
Who has underwritten the $60 billion worth of debt that Network Rail has got? I'll tell you, ask the taxpayer. There is no way.
It's on the state balance sheet.
Yeah, it is. But even before it was on the state balance sheet, when it was a not-for-profit company, the money that went in was underpinned by us, the taxpayer. We took the risk. The problem with the railway is that we take the risk, and when there are profits to be made, the private sector makes them, and heads or tails, they always win.
I'm wondering, and we're coming to them quite quickly, the Labour policy on standard at the moment is not to buy back the railways, it's to let the franchises
we don't have to buy them back. We
expire.
Well, I think looking at that was okay when
that will take a long while.
2015, but all the franchises, the main ones, were just coming up.
Yeah.
Now they've been re-signed, so that's a problem. I'd say the issue about the money side of this is important, and Michael raises some points about some of our crazy Treasury rules. But Transport for London is publicly owned and puts the investment in and is integrated and is a huge success.
Correct.
So what I believe is actually will need to be done in stages, and we mustn't interfere with open access. That was my caveat. There's a few open access operators that introduce genuine competition to Hull, to Sunderland. Now, for Hull, we're getting 7 direct train services, my old constituency, between Hull and London. We only got 1 under British Rail. We only got 1 under GNER and the franchises. The open access that we can't interfere with.
Here's a point of agreement.
Yes.
All right.
Well, look-
I'm sorry, man. We've overrun, actually.
Oh,
But
that's a shame.
Thank you for being with
Okay,
us and
thank
giving
you.
that
Train's left the
argument. Thank you.
station.
Actually, it hasn't, sadly. It's late. Naked wee mole rats late. Yes, a study has found the little creatures have mastered a social skill which eludes most politicians, the ability to stop talking and listen for a response from another member of the species. Songbirds and fireflies do it too, and I'm sure you knew that. Scientists hope that understanding this turn-taking behaviour will help them fathom the origins of conversation, which died on this show about 15 years ago. It would certainly make PMQs a little more bearable, but only a little. Someone who could never be mistaken for a naked mole rat, or a senior politician come to that, is comedian Andy Saltzman, who will be putting political scandals under the spotlight. And yes, if you must, the Fleece Book, the Snap Numpty, and God help us, the Tweet Munker are still available to you, should you wish to stick your oar in and tell us what you think. But why, in the name of Binky Berko, should we care? I have no idea. There were red faces in the White House again this week when one of the Donald staff accidentally referred to him as the Commander of Cheese rather than the Commander-in-Chief. Maybe that's where we've gone wrong all the time. Perhaps Mr. Trump ran for office thinking he'd be in charge of Vermont cheddar and Wisconsin Cracker Barrel. And who could blame him? Because as Monty Python once said, blessed are the cheesemakers. Certainly the Donald's talks on trade tariffs have caused more than a little indigestion in Europe, responding to claims of unsavoury phone calls with POTUS. President Macron said the conversations were like sausages. Better not explain what's inside. And if all that's got you reaching for your antacid heartburn tablets, then here's healthy, wholesome Miranda Green with her roundup of the week.
I'd do anything for my friends on this week. So when they told me that Michael was busy hanging out his shirts on the Siegfried line, and Alan, he's tied up with the 17th volume of his memoirs, so I thought I'd step up and represent the team at school sports day. Okay, better get the kit ready. Oh, great. Competitive dad, and it's Hunter from Gladiators. Facing a fair few hurdles this week was Chris Grayling. Tripped up by chaos on the railways, he then staggered into another stumbling block over the third runway at Heathrow. Woo!
Isn't this the worst kind of nationalisation? The public sector and taxpayers owning all of the Heathrow downsides and risks, but the private sector owning all of the upside and financial returns.
Oh, can I get some ice? Andrew wouldn't have to wait this long. Oh. Well, at least Grayling should get that policy over the line, even if there's a bit of bruising on the way.
Expansion at Heathrow will bring real benefits across the country, including a boost of up to £74 billion to passengers and the wider economy.
Immigration policy has been going round in circles. The NHS wants the government to enlist foreign doctors to fill up the gaps after we leave the EU. Ministers say they'll look at relaxing the rules. Can I relax yet?
It is something that I'm taking a fresh look at. I know a number of my colleagues certainly want me to take a look at this, and that's exactly what I'm doing. And I hope to think about this more carefully and see what can be done.
Also in a spin are foreign students, and the Home Secretary has committed to looking again at whether they should be included in the migration figures.
It is not my most urgent priority when it comes to immigration right now. We've talked about Windrush and other issues, but it is something I would like to look at again.
Following the referendum on abortion in the Republic of Ireland, the Commons held a debate on changing the law in Northern Ireland.
Are you seriously telling me that in a civilised world, rape, incest, or a fetus that is so sadly deformed that it could never live are not sufficient grounds for a woman to have the power to decide for herself?
So we have people today in Northern Ireland who are rearing families, who are contributing to society, who have been discarded and put in a bin before they were ever born.
So the British people have spoken. We are tying ourselves to Brexit, whatever the cost, even if that cost is of Armageddon-style proportions, as it was in leaked reports this week about a no-deal scenario. I'm sure it'll be fine.
Supermarkets running out of food within days. Hospitals running out of medicines within a fortnight. Petrol reserves dwindling after just 2 weeks. These are the concerns of UK government officials.
Maybe the Labour Party should consider some sports day team building. It might help them run in step on Brexit. Keir Starmer had to admit they're completely split on the issue.
It's the amendment that essentially says we should adopt the model that Norway has adopted, the EEA model. There are very strong and very different views across the PLP on that particular amendment. So whilst there's unity on all the others, and we'll be all voting together, on that amendment there are very divided views.
Amid all the Brexit doom, composer Andrew Lloyd Webber had strong words for fellow peers on the Remain side who won't finish the race. Come on, keep pulling.
I do not think you can possibly be part of an unelected House and vote against the will of the people. I myself felt that the House of Lords had become really very political.
Jumping up and down with fury at PMQs, Jeremy Corbyn hoped that rail shambles and Brexit chaos would be enough to get Mrs May the sack.
When it comes to Brexit, this government has delivered more delays and more cancellations than Northern Rail. The government's white paper is delayed, its customs proposals have been cancelled, and it's ripped up its own timetable, just like our shambolic privatised railways.
But the Brexiters feel that Mrs May's lack of detail and lack of progress is not podium-worthy.
The British people voted to leave the European Union, and it is this government that is delivering on the vote of the British people.
We do need a backstop, and for now at least, we still have David, they didn't hire me for my intellect, but for my character, Davis.
Have you personally signed off all the details of the government's backstop proposal we expect to be published tomorrow? And if it comes out without your explicit approval, can you stay in your job?
That's a question, I think, for the Prime Minister, to be honest, on the second one.
Earlier, it seemed Mrs May might be speared by divisions over the backstop proposals for customs arrangements with the EU. Last-minute rewording avoided her being hit with a Davis resignation and another reshuffle.
We are a government, and I think it's particularly true of Theresa May's government, that does operate by collective responsibility. We do come to collective decisions.
Arguing in public?
Well, sometimes that takes a little bit longer. Leaving the European Union is one of the most important things that we've done in this country for a very long time. It's important we get the decisions right.
And Miranda, who was carried into the studio only a few minutes ago, is with us now. Welcome back, Miranda. Now, Michael, the government is now saying we could be in the single market for goods and the customs union till the end of 2021, maybe longer. How's this Brexit business going?
Brexit doesn't mean Brexit. The key promise of the Prime Minister is now nonsense. I mean,
so is it worth the candle?
We are not going to be sucked into an ever closer European Union. We will have left the European Union, and it seems to me that even if the Remainers got their way and there were a second referendum and we one day reapplied for membership, we would be required in coming back into the European Union to join the single currency.
Yeah.
And the British people, in my view, will never vote to go into the European Union and join the single currency.
That may be true if we can make maybe irreversible. I don't know. But what I'm asking now is is it worth the candle? I mean, if the price of single market access is staying largely in alignment with EU rules and regulations,
it's not
which
worth,
seems to be, what's the point?
That's not the candle. That's my point. Nothing now is happening about trade and custom union, which looks like we're leaving the European Union.
No.
And we are bound by rules in the European Union to which we now make no contribution or will make no contribution.
No, we'll be rule takers.
And we will be rule takers and we won't have members of the European
So
Parliament.
what's the point?
And the point is that we're outside the European Union, so we cannot be sucked into ever closer European Union. We can no longer be
But we'd
part
have to
of that
follow,
project.
we wouldn't be able to do our own trade deals, and we'd have to follow all the rules and regulations from Brussels over which we'd have no say.
Well, I preempted you.
Is this what you voted for?
It is not what I voted for, but I preempted you by saying Brexit doesn't mean Brexit. That is the point that we have reached. The Prime Minister has been surrounded by Remainers. I think there has been a conspiracy to arrive at this situation. We've allowed the Northern Ireland situation to dictate the entire policy. And we arrive at a situation which everybody knows is unsatisfactory. And I think that's part of the plan as well, because the Remainers believe that it will be so unstable that it will trigger a reconsideration before long.
A lot of people say now, there's not David Davis doing the negotiations. There's Ollie Robbins, who's in the Cabinet Office, is a senior civil servant. He was in David Davis's department, but they didn't get on together. But rather than getting rid of him altogether, he was brought wholeheartedly into the Cabinet Office. He's a Remainer, like all senior civil servants are, and that he's really calling the shots. And that he didn't even want a date on the backstop you were talking about in your report. Do you hear that as well?
Well, it seems to be the case, doesn't it, that David Davis is not fully in the loop on preparations for his own negotiating position. So it must be the case.
Because he had to insist on the change.
Absolutely,
which
after
meant he
the
wasn't
fact.
in the... Apparently the documents
Yeah.
weren't circulated to him.
Absolutely. So he's trying to claw back a position that's already been taken by number 10. So that must be what's going on. And I'm very interested to hear Michael's reaction to today, because it seems to me the absolutely key thing is how the Conservative Party reacts to this. Because, you know, tonight you've already had Peter Bone saying, well, this isn't leaving, we're not leaving. But if you also have people taking Michael's view, maybe she'll get away with it, you know, because...
See, the one thing they say in Downing Street, they say, oh, this is just a backstop for a start. We would hope to do a deal before December 2021. And within this, yeah, we're signing up still for a period to a customs union, probably to single market in goods, but no free movement. And that seems to matter more to Mrs. May. That's the one thing she seems to think that she still has to deliver. Of course, we don't know whether Mr. Barney is going to say, all right, you can have all this, but no free movement.
It may be too much like cherry picking.
Exactly. So we're still going to wait on that. Alan, the government's position is, what shall we say, to be kind of difficult. Can you tell us about Labour's position? What bit of it makes sense?
None of it in terms of that amendment. That amendment would have been fine 2 years ago, when you're talking around the edges about where you go and what direction you take. You know, you have things like complete access to the single market. Now's not the time for that. Now's the time to come down with a policy that is meaningful and that the EU can understand as well, the Commission can understand. To me, it's always been that the outcome of Article 50 will either be we crash out with no deal or we drop into EEA stroke F.
But again, it's interesting you do that, but the EEA, again, I think why Mr. Corbyn and Mr. McDonnell and others are a bit reluctant to go down this road now is on the free movement issue, because if you're in the EEA, there is free movement.
Well, they haven't said that. That is a fair point, except that as I keep pointing out, there's things happening now. So look at what Switzerland have done in terms of their deal. They're part of EFTA.
They're not part of the EEA.
They're not part of the EEA. if there's things we're going to negotiate
but Brussels have said they will not accept the result of that Swiss referendum.
That's always the issue, and that might be the breakdown.
And they haven't stopped free movement.
But at least we would have a policy and a clear direction of where we go. I think Michael's view is fascinating, by the way.
Don't you think it was interesting tonight?
I think it was really interesting. And I'll buy into that, actually, because what was on the ballot paper is, do we leave or do we remain? And Michael's point about ever closer union, which I don't agree with, but it's always been his point. I think it disappeared years ago. But I'm prepared to give that a run and
Just
say...
choosing a future path.
And say we keep the economic advantages, but we don't get sucked into ever closer union.
Michael?
I would defend that position.
I'm just slightly disconcerted. I didn't mean to say anything interesting.
Well,
you really do.
We're slightly disconcerted because you did. And I may well have to go and lie in a dark room after this programme to get over it. But again, I mean, the nature of our future relationship with the EU, it won't now be determined until we enter the transition period. It will probably go beyond the transition period because we've now added another year with this backstop, Miranda. But we start to pay the £39 billion immediately after the March of next year. I mean, we've been outmanoeuvred on this.
That is an understatement. Textbooks will be written on the inefficiency of the incompetence of the British negotiation. But to call it incompetence is to be too kind. I think this has been a conspiracy. I mean, this, as you said a moment ago, all the senior civil servants are Remainers. About half the cabinet are Remainers. Probably more than half the Conservative Parliamentary Party are Remainers.
Do you think it's conspiracy rather than just that they're not up to it?
Well, what they weren't up to was doing their duty, in my view. I mean, the British people had voted to leave, but they continued to take this patrician view that the British people had got it wrong and shouldn't be allowed to do something which was going to do them so much damage.
Is the May government teetering on the brink now?
Well, the thing is, we've thought that for well over.
There's been a lot of teetering.
There's been a lot of teetering since the election this time last year. I mean, the thing is, earlier today it looked as if her cabinet could collapse, as if the negotiation would have to be put in the hands of somebody else. But actually, it keeps staggering on. And if we end up with some sort of compromise deal which can be made acceptable to large chunks of those who voted leave, not all of them by any means, then actually the May government may have pulled something out of this horrendous sort of fix that they're in. If they can survive long enough.
I think I'm atypical of Leavers because I didn't want there to be a referendum in the first place.
True. Mr. Barnier has to work out how hard he pushes this now because, a number of nation states have been saying to Mr. Barnier, let's not push it too hard. And he keeps on saying, well, every time I push it hard, I win. And you see, in this business now that we've had we leave legally in March, but then we have the transition period, which free movement of peoples continues. But the British are assuming that free movement ends with the end of the transition, but we still go to the backstop without free movement. If he turns around and says, actually, if you want the backstop with a date of December, you're going to have to continue free movement to then I think that puts the government in a really difficult position.
It does, but all the analysis shows that immigration is going down the public's concern. That might be because they voted.
That's another matter. It should be an issue. It's another matter.
But I think that what Barnier's conscious of is he doesn't want May to go. He wants her there. I can't see there being another general election. I mean, we've got a Fixed-Term Parliament Act. It needs 2/3 of Parliament to vote to have an election, or the government to pass a vote of no confidence in itself twice to trigger an election. I don't think it's going to happen.
We'll leave it there. Something tells me we might come back to it. Maybe. Though I doubt if Michael will say anything interesting again. I mean, I'll have to wait.
I should certainly try not to.
We'll have to wait another decade.
Miranda,
Miranda, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Now, in a desperate attempt to freshen up this dreary format, here's a University Challenge type question for you. Who said that one of the key problems today is that politics is such a disgrace? Good people don't go into it. Nope, no idea? OK, let me help. Was it A, Mother Teresa, B, Alan Johnson, or C, Donald Trump? Yep, it was the Donald, which I think we can all agree makes him both prescient and imbued with an unusual sense of self-knowledge. Of course, politics has been regularly marred by disgrace. We can all recall the waxy camera flash stares of politicians grinning at the hastily convened press conferences, initially denying everything. Then a few days later, more media scrutiny, gradually bowing to the inevitable, before leaving office grimly to spend more time with their distraught families, or in some cases, the lumpy, grumpy inmates of cell block B. So what is our fascination with the political fall from grace? Tonight, we're putting scandal in the spotlight. There was one word on everyone's lips this week as a very English scandal concluded on screen.
We have to cut that word. Which word? That one. What one? That one. Bunnies.
But can you ever recover from a scandal? Disgraced former MP Jonathan Aitken is going back to the clink, this time as a chaplain. If things turn pear-shaped, you can always, of course, pardon yourself.
There's nothing that limits the presidential power of pardon from a federal crime, not a state crime. President Trump has no need to do that. He didn't do anything wrong.
Cambridge Analytica's boss had an interesting spin on Scandal 2.
You're not the victim here.
What happens if I was the victim? What happens if, as we've seen, we're accused of working Brexit, we didn't work in Brexit?
By contrast, the Dutch Prime Minister showed that scandal can be averted by displaying humility. Comedian Andy Zaltzman thinks the media loves to salivate over a scandal. He might be right. And Andy's with us now. Welcome to the programme.
Hello.
What's wrong with salivating at a bit of scandal?
Well, I guess it keeps us entertained and passes time between now and the merciful claw of the Reaper. But
You're
I think
a cheery wee chap, aren't you?
Well, it's late. I think there's a danger that it can. The smaller scandals can take attention away from the things we should be really getting upset about.
So, but we've come back. We're talking about the. I mean, it shows you the power of drama, because we're all talking about it because of the Thorpe scandal. And Hugh Grant's amazing performance in it and the beautiful way that it's put together. Not a huge budget either. And that was a scandal, wasn't it? The Thorpe business was a scandal.
That was a high-quality scandal.
That was a grade A scandal.
And it made you slightly nostalgic. And we've had Amber Rudd resigning recently because she inadvertently misled people. No one's going to be making a TV drama about that in 40 years' time. Let's have some proper scandals.
What, not even Channel 4?
Well, it's possible. It's very hard, as discussed, to see into the future. But the royal family now is an almost scandal-free zone. It's very disappointing. Think about Charles II had an estimated 12 to 17 children by around 8 different... When you have to ballpark the number of children you've got, I mean, if that happened today, that would be the biggest royal scandal ever been. In those days, that was fine.
I know, they're all scandal-free for them. It can last, though, can it?
For the royals?
Yes.
Well, I think for another 1,000 years, they're
No, I meant the scandal. We have to have another
yeah.
scandal. You think we concentrate too much on, or get carried away by small scandals?
I think with the Australian cricket ball tampering scandal, Australia tore itself apart over that. It seems completely unconcerned by the way it treats asylum seekers, which is at the lower end of human behaviour. And in the same week that ball tampering scandal happened, the boss of Barclays Bank in America, they were fined $2 billion in a court case over mis-selling of mortgages, and described it as a good result. There are no tearful press conferences from the boss of Barclays Bank apologising for letting down...
no one being fired.
Well, no, and apologising to all the fans of mortgage broking.
I mean, I see what you mean in a way that we do. The sort of big issues that are kind of just taken in our stride, and we do, to use we do salivate over the small.
Yes, and I guess that's human nature. We've been... salivating over small, salacious things since we emerged from the sea, probably.
Is the Thorpe scandal the biggest political scandal of modern times?
Yes, I think it probably is, and I think I've only just realised that through the
drama.
Because there was a jury, there was a result. He was found not guilty. We kind of moved on. By the way,
and it involved attempted murder.
Yeah, but that's the point. This was a politician who was in a conspiracy to bring about a murder. He was found not guilty, by the way. I have to continue to say that. But both the drama and the documentary suggest that this was a miscarriage of justice. That is an enormous scandal.
I think for young people watching, many young people did watch because they probably didn't know who Jeremy Thorpe was, had never heard of him. But it must have come to them as a scandal to see that not that long ago, in living memory, it was a scandal to be homosexual.
Well, I'm not a young person, and it was it reminded me of that.
It showed you how much things have changed.
Can I make a point? There's another issue here about the media moving on. I mean, that Sajid Javid interview on Sunday, it's all about immigration, but he revealed that 63 of Windrush people had been sent back to the Caribbean.
Yes.
It's the first time a figure had ever come out of it. Sort of diddly squat in terms of the papers.
Because you'd like to track them down and find out what happened and where are they. Would they like to come back? And,
absolutely.
And so on. You wonder now, though, if a big scandal like the Thorpe scandal could happen now. Do you think it's harder to cover up scandals now?
Well, I think there's an element, and related to that, in terms of the way people live their private lives, I think the electorate just doesn't care anymore what people's sexuality is. So I think that specific type of scandal is less likely to happen. And I guess we're more looking at things like Hillsborough and Grenfell, and that's kind of broader socio-political scandals. I don't necessarily have a central figure, but reveal pretty dark things about the way we run.
And they're more societal scandals than personal scandals.
Yes, which is less tittillating and therefore
probably
harder to write about as a journalist and probably comedian.
Andy, speaking of that, what are you up to?
I'm doing a run in London in July of my Satirist for Hire show, then heading up to the Edinburgh Festival in August.
Oh, they're excellent. London, then Edinburgh.
Yes.
Tough life.
It's a very hard life.
Andy, thank you very much. Now, that's your lot for tonight, folks, but not for us. We're heading off to Lulu's to raise a glass of Blue Nun Royale to Peter Stringfellow, the nightclub owner who sadly passed away this morning after a private battle with cancer. The self-styled king of clubs took a keen interest in politics, which sometimes brought him into this very studio. He once said he was the most lovable person on earth and was puzzled why Diane Abbott really disliked him. Me too. He once threatened to go into politics, mainly to try to remove Nick Clegg as the deputy PM, but he didn't. Seen from today's perspective, he was, of course, a relic from a bygone era, but he had charm and a sense of fun, which made him good company. People liked to be with him, which is why over the years he mixed with everybody, from Stephen Hawking to Margaret Thatcher, and even with us. We'll miss him. Nighty-night. Don't let Donald Trump's impersonation of John Redwood bite.